Mike lives in Collierville, Tennessee with his wife of over 40 years, Suzanne. They have 3 married children and 7 grandchildren. Please welcome Lieutenant Colonel Mike Ware.
I think I scared her when I said I needed this thing to disconnect, so just a second. I want to thank you all for being here today, and I really want to thank DAR for allowing me to come and speak with you today. I mean, they've been involved for over 100 years in preservation and education, and I was talking to my buddy Ray over here, the World War II veteran, and he says as he ages, preservation gets much more important to him. So thank you, and Ray thanks you for the preservation part of that. But most of all, I'd like to thank you all out here, because the greatest honor you can give any veteran is your time and your patience and your thoughts. Because for you to show up here, that is telling us that you do honor those that have served in this world. So thank you so much for being here today. I will tell you, to stand under the Doughboy statue 100 years from whenever those rifles and those bombs quit going off is an amazing honor, because it was the war that end all wars. But as we know, that wasn't true. And shortly thereafter, young men and heroes like Ray here got to sign up one more time and go to World War II. And most of the veterans that you talk to in that war and others, they came back and they just melded into society, so we didn't hear their stories. Until recently, when they put out the books, The Greatest Generation and all those. So I'm going to tell you a few of their stories, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the standard veteran as we go through here. About 3 years ago, I was standing underneath the auspice of another great statue. It was in France. And as we stood in front of this colonnade that had white columns 50 feet high, there was a stout American coming out of the waves that was 35, 40 feet high in that statue. Along with me were 13 or 14 wheelchairs, and there were men standing in the wheelchairs. We had 6 to the left and 6 to the right, and I had the guy who was in the center. And there's about the same number of people as I see here today, all trying to take pictures of him. And shortly in this colonnade, out came 2 well-dressed gentlemen, and they stopped in front. And the first one introduced himself as the executive director of the American Cemetery at Normandy, France. And that's where we were. And he gets there, and after a short introduction of what that encompassed there at the cemetery, he said some words that I will never forget. He looks at the World War II veterans, the 13 that we had in attendance, and he says, "Heroes, you will see there are areas of this cemetery that is blocked off with 'Do Not Enter' tape." And he goes, "We're having a Memorial Day ceremony here in a couple of weeks, and we want to make sure the grass and everything looks really good for the cameras and all that stuff." He says, "But if you hear nothing else that I say, you disregard those 'Do Not Enter' signs. For every piece of grass that is on this hallowed ground belongs to you. It was the blood and the sweat and the courage that your compadres who stay with us here 24 hours a day paid for every blade of grass that's in here. So when you go out there, if you need to kneel on them, you kneel on them." So as we turned around and I started to push my guy, Mr. Vince, all of his stories, I'd spent 8 hours sitting beside of him from Atlanta to Paris. He was second wave D-Day. And as we turned and we looked at those nearly 9,400 grave markers, walking down the reflecting poles to the mausoleum that's down there that has the names of 1,557 missing in action, all the stories that he told me started coming back. There was no reason for him to speak again. For he told me about getting off the mothership and getting into the landing craft. They were all huddled in the center with the bullets bouncing off the side and all the rockets going from the ships to the shore and the same coming at him. He remembers hitting the sandbar early, and they had to release him early, and he jumps out, and he's holding his gun over his head, and he goes up to his neck in the water. He could not swim. He thought he was going to drown. And as he went to shore, he was pushing other Americans out of the way who had not made it to shore. The waters turned from blue to American blood red. And as he hit the beach, he can remember the sand, he can remember the smell of the burning tanks as he crawled, and he's trying to make a way, and he remembers hearing people screaming, "Help me, Mom, come and help me." And he couldn't, because his job was to get to the beach and get on and fight the war. He was lucky that day. He made it all the way. 2,000 of his countrymen died on that beach that day. Mr. Vince continued. He fought through Paris. He fought through the Battle of the Bulge. He helped liberate a concentration camp called Dachau. And when I looked at him, he said, "I'd do it all again if I had to for the freedoms that we had." And you wonder if ours today would do the same thing. About 2 or 3 days later, I was pushing Mr. Harlan. Mr. Harlan was a Seabee in the Pacific, and he wanted to go to Europe to see where his classmates had fought and died. And we were going through a place called Point the Hawk, and that's where 4 big guns were of the Nazis that wreaked havoc on the landing crafts and stuff on D-Day. And as we're going, walking down through her, I noticed 3 people on the right-hand side that seemed to be following us. It was looked like a mom and dad about 50 years old, and a pretty young lady looked like about 30. Not that we notice those things at our age. My wife's not here. Anyway, shortly she came up, the young lady came up and pecked me on the shoulder, and she said, "Can I talk to him?" And I said, "Oh, he'd love that." And so she goes around and she takes his hand and she asks him his service. And he told her about going in the Pacific and being a Seabee and being on Okinawa. And then she looked at him and she said, "Well, you know what? I'm a Seabee and I just got back from Afghanistan." And so they talked, and he asked about her service. And then she got up and she was crying and she left. And I said, "Well, Mr. Harlan, how about them apples?" He looks at me and he says, "I'll tell you one thing, I got all the Seabees too early because they did not look like that." Then he goes, some really important things. He goes, "She inspired me. Because now I know our younger generation has the same courage, the same loyalty, the same dedication to protecting our freedom." And you know, that's the way it is these days, because we have young men and women that are over in the desert right now protecting our freedom. But like the World War II people, they come back in the nation and they just want to meld back into society. You don't even know they exist. They're in your churches, they're in your neighborhoods, they're in everywhere you are, but you'll never see them unless you get to a national holiday, kind of like we have today. And then all of a sudden you'll see the hats come out, or you'll see the jackets, or you'll see something to identify them as a veteran. And it's not to bring attention to themselves, it's to honor all those like Ray and them that's come before us, that's protected our freedom. But if you'll go up to them, and when you thank them for their service, if you will ask them about their service, they will tell you some stories that is amazing. They'll tell you about heroes and things that went on, and it's never about them, it's always about the other person. These stories will be humorous and laughter and great stories of great relationships, some of them building to maybe even more than family. But there will be also that of great grief, where they had to hold their best friend as he died from his wounds. And those are the stories that we need to continue to tell about this thing that we call freedom. Because if you don't know how important that is, walk up to somebody that's got the POW on it, prisoner of war, because they've lost their freedom. Olin Pickens, North Africa, lives just south of here. Mr. Luke shot down over Austria, 2 years in concentration camps in Germany. Or Gene Smith from just down in Mississippi, shot down over North Mississippi. He probably did that too. He sort of tried to kill him down there on the bombing line, but that's okay. Over Hanoi, and spent 5.5 years in a Hanoi Hilton undergoing Savage Street 6x6 cell, starving the whole time. And if you ask Gene how he survived that, he says, because I had faith. I had faith in my fellow POWs. I had faith in my country that they would not leave me there. They would do everything. I had faith in my God that if it didn't work out, I would go to a better place. And if you have faith, you can have hope and trust that it will get better, that you will get to the life that you want to lead. So if you have the faith and the hope, you can have life no matter where you are and what your situation is. And he said, you know what I found out? He said, after I got back, I realized there was a fourth thing, and that was love, because I could love more deeply than I ever thought I could love. The sun sets, the sun rises, the rain, a shower. He goes, you learn to love all day. So if you have faith, you can have hope. If you have hope, you can have life. And if you have life, you can love more dearly. I will also say that we have all heard the stories about our flag and the respect of our flag. I will tell you a little bit about why that flag is so important to we veterans. You hear that a lot, and probably too many of you. Because whenever we look at the flag, and I tell a lot of audience, what do you see when you look at that flag? I say, let me tell you a little about what a veteran sees. A veteran sees General Washington going across the Delaware River in the Revolutionary War. We see brother fighting brother in the Civil War. We see the gas trenches of World War I, the bombings and the concentration camps of World War II, the cold mountains of Korea, the rice paddies of Vietnam, the sands of the Middle East. We also see the most compassionate nation on earth that reaches out to friend or foe whenever they need our help. Yes, we see that it has tattered edges, but the Air Force has this thing called the motto of aim high. Well, that's what our country does. It aims high. We are not going to get there all the time of this thing called liberty and freedom and justice for all. We're going to fail at times, but we aim high to get back there. And that's why that flag is so dedicated to us, so serious to us. So whenever we say the pledge or sing the anthem, we stand a little straighter. We lift ourselves up a little straighter because we know the freedom that represents and has since the Revolutionary War. I'll end with one more story for you, and it's about a guy by the name of Lieutenant Colonel Bill Neal. He grew up in Carrollton, Mississippi. He went to Mississippi State University. He joined the Air Force back in the early 50s. He went to Vietnam in the late 60s as an A-1E Sandy pilot. And I don't know whether you know what that is, but that was an airplane that did close air support to protect the troops that were in close combat, or if an airplane was shot down, that he would go over there and protect the pilot until the helicopters could get in to get him. Well, on one of his missions coming back, he was engaged by surface-to-air artillery. Took a hit in the right wing of his airplane. It caught fire, it went out of control. He pulled his ejection seat handles. It didn't work. On the third attempt to get out of his airplane, he was able to get over the side. He got one swing in his parachute and hit the ground and injured his leg. As he was starting to crawl away from there, the bad guys came out of the woods shooting at him. His wingman, without any bullets, rolled in on these guys and chased them back into the woods. And about that time, he heard the familiar sound of the helicopters that he usually protected. And under intense fire, these helicopters come down, picked him up, put him in the helicopter, got him away from there, and he said, you know, whenever I looked up, I saw the faces of 18 and 19-year-old kids. The bravest, most dedicated men you've ever seen. That their skill and their courage come in and picked him up under intense fire. And when he got back, he thanked them profusely, needless to say, because he didn't have to go be a POW. Well, about 25 years later, I attended Colonel Neal's memorial ceremony. And at that memorial ceremony, they played taps that you will hear shortly. There was a 21-gun salute. They took the flag that is so marvelous, and they folded it in 13 crisp folds, put it next to the chest, and went over and handed it to his next of kin and her 4 kids, the second of which was my wife. So Bill was not just a hero, he was my father-in-law. And those words of courage, of dedication, skill, those same things. Sounded like somebody's life, no matter what field of study you're in. That's the way you need to live, and that's the way we live. So as I leave you today, I can say every veteran that's in here hopes for one thing, that whenever God calls us home, when we breathe our last breath, you will hear taps play. You will hear a 21-gun salute. You will see a flag folded and handed, a flag that's still flying here in this park, that's by the graveyards, that's around your churches, your civic buildings, anywhere in America, because if it is, that means that America still values the pillars of freedom that we value today. That there's young men and women still willing to fight for this thing that we call freedom, because it is worth it. So as you go forth from here today, just remember, God bless America and God bless all those